The billionaire head of the most terrifying syndicate in North America knelt in the filthy, soot-stained concrete of a rain-drenched subway station, ignoring the way the grease ruined his custom velvet suit, entirely focused on his 4-year-old son, who had just broken 3 months of traumatized silence by whispering 2 soft words to a broke street musician. If this story grips your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss another high-stakes romance story where the most dangerous men in the world drop to their knees for the ones they love. For 3 agonizing months, the syndicate had bled in silence. Dominick Vance, a man whose very name made international law enforcement agencies tread carefully, had watched his world collapse into absolute quiet. After a brutal ambush by a rival cartel destroyed his heavily armored convoy and took his late wife's life, his little boy, Leo, had shut down completely.
Top child psychologists, neurologists, and high-priced therapists from around the globe had failed to coax a single sound from the child. Leo simply stared ahead, eyes wide and vacant, carrying the heavy weight of a horror no 4-year-old should ever know. Dominick would have given up his entire criminal empire, his billion-dollar shipping routes, and every piece of blood-soaked gold in his vaults just to hear his son giggle again. He spent millions transforming his fortress-like estate into a haven of quiet luxury, filling rooms with endless toys, gentle caregivers, and soft light. Yet Leo remained an untouchable glass statue, locked in his own dark world. Then came a rainy Tuesday afternoon in downtown Manhattan. Dominick was riding in the back of his armored, bulletproof Maybach, surrounded by 4 heavily armed bodyguards in a trailing SUV.
His mind was heavy with syndicate negotiations, betrayed alliances, and the constant threat of rival factions looking for any sign of weakness in his formidable armor. But his focus remained entirely on the small child sitting silently beside him in the plush leather seat, clutching a faded velvet teddy bear to his chest. Traffic ground to a complete halt near the grand entrance of a dilapidated subway station. The noise of honking horns, blaring sirens, and yelling pedestrians bounced off the wet asphalt. Leo suddenly sat upright, his little hands pressing against the dark-tinted window. His big, expressive eyes were wide with a sudden, intense curiosity that Dominick had not seen in months. Before Dominick could react, the child pressed the quick release button on his child seat and opened the rear door of the idling car. Dominick's heart plummeted into his throat. "Leo!"
The child ran straight into the mouth of the filthy underground subway passage, his small feet splashing through puddles of dirty water. Dominick threw open his door, his high-priced leather shoes cutting through the greasy mud as he sprinted after his son. Behind him, 4 massive, suit-clad enforcers drew their concealed weapons, their radio headsets buzzing with frantic orders as they formed a protective wall around their don. Dominick descended the damp stone steps, his dark eyes frantically scanning the crowded platform below. Commuters scrambled out of the way, terrified by the sudden appearance of 6'4" Dominick Vance, whose tailored black overcoat barely concealed the silver-plated firearm at his hip. There, near a rusting steel pillar, sat a young man on a cracked wooden stool. Kyle was exhausted, pale, and shivering in a threadbare sweater that was frayed at the cuffs.
His fingers were red and calloused from hours of exposure to the damp chill blowing through the underground tunnels. He held a well-worn cello between his knees, his eyes closed as his bow danced gracefully across the strings, coaxing out a melody so painfully beautiful, so deeply tender and heartbreaking, that it seemed to pause the very passage of time in the grimy station. Kyle had nothing left to his name. His rent was 3 months overdue. His landlord had threatened to throw his few remaining possessions into the street by nightfall, and he hadn't had a warm meal in 2 days. But when he played, none of that mattered. The music was his only defense against a world that had offered him nothing but cruelty, coldness, and neglect. Leo was standing less than 2 feet away from the young musician. The little boy had dropped his stuffed bear onto the wet floor. He reached out with both tiny, trembling hands and gently touched the smooth wood of the instrument, his face illuminated by a sudden, brilliant spark of life. Kyle slowly opened his eyes, pausing his bow. He didn't look at the massive, terrifying men in tailored suits surrounding the area. He didn't see the heavy hand of the syndicate boss hovering inches from his concealed holster. Kyle simply looked at the small child, smiled with gentle warmth, and lowered himself until he was sitting on the cold stone floor right in front of the boy. "Hey there, little guy," Kyle said softly, his voice clear and kind amidst the roar of the underground trains. "Do you like the music?" Leo took a step forward, wrapped his small arms around Kyle's neck, and buried his face in the frayed fabric of the musician's sweater. Then, in a tiny, sweet whisper that echoed clearly through the sudden silence of the station, the child spoke for the first time in 90 days. Play again, please." Dominick froze in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The ruthless Don, a man who had brought powerful rival syndicates to their knees without blinking, felt a lump form in his chest. His eyes stung with unbidden tears as he watched his traumatized son cling to this total stranger as if he were a beacon of light in absolute darkness. Dominick stepped forward, his heavy leather boots coming to a halt right beside Kyle. He dropped to his knees in the filth of the subway floor, ignoring the gasps of his surrounding guards. He pulled his son into a fierce, protective embrace, but Leo kept one hand tightly hooked into the cuff of Kyle's worn sweater, refusing to let go. Dominick looked up, his sharp, storm-gray eyes locking onto Kyle's wide, astonished blue ones. Dominick's gaze was intense, possessing an authority that commanded instant respect, yet beneath the hard exterior was an overwhelming, terrifying gratitude. "Name your price," Dominick said, his deep, commanding voice cutting through the damp subway air. "Whatever you want, $1 million, a house, whatever it takes, you are coming with me right now." Kyle blinked, startled by the sheer power radiating from the man in front of him. I can't just leave. My cello, my apartment." Dominick stood up, effortlessly picking up his son with one arm while reaching down with his other hand to pull Kyle up by his wrist. The grip was firm, warm, and utterly non-negotiable. "Your cello comes with us," Dominick declared, his eyes burning with an unshakable resolve. "And as for your apartment, consider yourself moved out. You belong to my household now." Kyle was a man who lived on the absolute margins of society. Raised in the foster care system, he had learned early on that the world was a harsh, unforgiving place for someone without money or powerful connections. He had worked 3 grueling jobs while attending music school, only to be forced to drop out when his tuition funds ran dry. His current reality was a small, mold-infested studio apartment in the worst part of the city. His landlord, a ruthless, sleazy man named Mr. Higgins, took pleasure in harassing Kyle every single week. Higgins knew Kyle had no family to stand up for him, no lawyers to protect his rights, and no money to fight back. That very morning, before heading into the freezing subway tunnels to play for spare change, Kyle had been cornered in the hallway by Higgins and 2 hulking bailiffs. Higgins had shoved Kyle against the peeling wallpaper, kicking his worn instrument case and demanding double the overdue rent in cash by midnight, or else he would personally throw Kyle's belongings into the gutter and break his fingers so he could never play again. Kyle had said nothing. He had simply swallowed his pride, held his head high, and walked away with quiet dignity. He was not a fighter with his fists, but he possessed an internal strength, a quiet, unyielding integrity that allowed him to endure endless cruelty without losing his humanity or turning bitter. Now, sitting in the back of a luxury armored vehicle worth more than all the buildings in his old neighborhood combined, Kyle felt surreal. The contrast between his poverty and this unfathomable wealth was staggering. Soft, ambient leather smelled of rich vanilla and expensive tobacco. The floorboards were carpeted in thick wool. Next to him sat the small boy, Leo, who had refused to move away from his side. Leo had rested his head against Kyle's arm, holding Kyle's calloused hand in his tiny grip, fast asleep. Across from them sat Dominick Vance. Up close, the syndicate Don was an intimidating figure. Wide shoulders, broad chest, a sharp jawline carved from granite, and eyes so piercing they felt like they could read every secret written in Kyle's soul. Yet whenever Dominick looked at his son, his hard expression softened into something profound and fierce. "Who are you?" Kyle asked softly, mindful not to wake the child. "And why are you bringing me into your car? I'm just a street musician." "You are the man who restored my son's voice," Dominick replied, his voice a low rumble. "That makes you the most important person in this city. My name is Dominick Vance." Kyle's eyes widened slightly. Even living in poverty, he knew that name. Dominick Vance was a legendary shadow figure, a titan of industry on the surface, but secretly the absolute ruler of the city's most powerful underground syndicate. Politicians bowed to him. The police looked the other way. Rival organizations spoke his name in fearful whispers. "I don't belong in your world, Mr. Vance," Kyle said quietly, looking down at his worn, holey sneakers. "I don't fit into high society, and I certainly don't fit into whatever it is you do."
"You fit wherever my son needs you," Dominick said firmly, leaning forward slightly. The sheer intensity of his presence made Kyle's heart race, not from fear, but from an overwhelming, unfamiliar sensation of being completely seen. Leo hasn't spoken a word, smiled, or touched anyone since the day his mother died in an ambush. The doctors called it profound psychogenic mutism. They said he might never recover. Then you played a piece of music, and he spoke. Dominick extended a hand, his long, powerful fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair away from Kyle's pale forehead. The touch was surprisingly tender, sending a sharp jolt of electricity down Kyle's spine. "I pay my debts, musician," Dominick whispered, his dark eyes searching Kyle's face. "And starting today, you are under my protection." The Maybach pulled into a grand, high-walled estate surrounded by armed perimeter guards, attack dogs, and state-of-the-art security systems.
The mansion rose like a dark marble fortress against the gray sky. Inside, the estate was breathtaking, but cold. Wealth screamed from every polished floorboard, every priceless oil painting, and every crystal chandelier. Yet the place lacked warmth. Until Leo woke up and dragged Kyle by the hand straight into the main living hall. Before Kyle could even take off his jacket, the grand double doors burst open. Enter Victor Vance, Dominick's younger brother and the ruthless second-in-command of the syndicate. Victor was accompanied by 3 high-ranking syndicate lieutenants, all dressed in tailored suits, their faces hardened by years of violence and crime. Victor swept into the room with a sneer, his dark eyes immediately landing on Kyle's worn clothes, dirty shoes, and cheap cello case. "What is this trash doing in the main estate, Dominick?" Victor snapped, stepping aggressively into Kyle's personal space.
"We are in the middle of a war with the Russian syndicate. Our roots are being questioned, and you bring a homeless street beggar into the inner sanctum. He's a security risk. Look at him. He probably smells of subway trash." Victor reached out with a sneer, aiming to grab Kyle's cello case to hurl it toward the door. Kyle didn't flinch. He didn't cry out or shrink back. Instead, he immediately pulled the instrument behind his body, stepping firmly between Victor and the fragile cello. He stood tall, his chin raised, looking Victor directly in the eye with an unbroken, quiet dignity. "You can insult my clothes all you want," Kyle said, his voice cold and steady, devoid of any fear. "But do not touch my instrument. It's worth more than your manners." Victor's face darkened with rage. He raised a heavy, leather-gloved hand to strike Kyle across the face for talking back to a syndicate commander. "Why, you little—"
A split second before Victor's hand could land, a hand clamped down on Victor's wrist like a hydraulic steel vise. Dominick moved so fast he was a blur. He twisted Victor's wrist backward, forcing the massive lieutenant down onto his knees with effortless, brutal force. The room went dead silent. The surrounding lieutenants paled, stepping back instantly. Dominick leaned down, his face inches from his brother's ear, his voice dripping with lethal ice. "If you ever raise a hand toward him again, Victor, I will personally break every bone in your fingers, one by one," Dominick growled. His grip tightened until the leather of Victor's glove creaked under the immense pressure. "He is not a beggar. He is the guardian of my son's spirit. From this moment on, a threat to Kyle is a direct declaration of war against me." Dominick shoved Victor away. Victor stumbled back, holding his bruised wrist, his eyes burning with resentment. But he dared not speak another word. Dominick turned to his chief security officer, Marcus. "Take Leo to his room for his bath. Kyle, come with me." Dominick led Kyle through a series of grand corridors to the master wing of the mansion. He pushed open two massive mahogany doors, revealing a lavish private suite featuring a king-sized bed, a fireplace roaring with warm flame, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the grand gardens, and a private balcony. On a polished stand near the window sat a brand-new, hand-crafted Italian cello worth tens of thousands of dollars. Kyle stood in the doorway, breathless. This is too much. I can't accept this." "You will accept it," Dominick said softly, walking up behind Kyle. He stood so close Kyle could feel the heat radiating from the Don's broad chest. Dominick reached around him, gently unbuttoning Kyle's damp coat and peeling it off his shoulders, his hands brushing over Kyle's collarbone. "You have suffered enough, Kyle. You spent your life being pushed around by people who were weaker than you. In this house, no one touches you. No one speaks down to you." Kyle turned around, looking up into Dominick's intense, dark eyes. "Why are you doing this? It's not just about Leo, is it?" Dominick raised his hand, his thumb softly tracing the curve of Kyle's lower lip. "You stood up to Victor without a second thought to protect your music. Most men in my organization drop to their knees and beg when Victor looks at them. You have a heart of pure steel, disguised behind that soft face. I haven't seen true integrity like yours in 15 years. A soft knock interrupted the moment. Marcus stood at the door, holding a thick dossier. "Boss," Marcus reported, bowing his head respectfully. "We did a full background check on Kyle, as requested. We found something urgent regarding his prior living situation." Dominick took the dossier, his eyes scanning the pages rapidly.
His expression transformed from warmth to absolute terrifying fury. His landlord, Mr. Higgins, Marcus explained, has just broken into Kyle's old apartment. Higgins seized all of Kyle's remaining family heirlooms, including his late mother's sheet music and personal journals, claiming they are collateral for fake overdue fines. Higgins is currently hosting an auction in the apartment building courtyard, publicly selling off Kyle's belongings to local thugs. Kyle's face turned deathly pale. "My mother's journals? No, that's all I have left of her. She gave me those before she died." Kyle made a move toward the door, desperate to run back into the dangerous night to save his mother's memory, but Dominick reached out and caught him by the waist, pulling Kyle firmly against his chest. "Stay here," Dominick commanded softly, his hands resting possessively on Kyle's hips. "No, you don't understand. I have to go back," Kyle pleaded, tears welling in his eyes. "He'll burn them. He's cruel."
Dominick looked down into Kyle's eyes, his expression uncompromising, dark and filled with a terrifying promise. "You are not going back to beg that insect for your own property," Dominick said, his tone absolute. "We are going together, and by the time I am finished, that man will regret the very day he was born." 15 minutes later, a fleet of 5 blacked-out armored SUVs tore through the rainy streets of the city, cutting through red lights with terrifying precision. Inside the lead vehicle, Kyle sat next to Dominick. Dominick held Kyle's cold hand in his own broad, warm palm, his fingers intertwined tightly with Kyle's. "You don't have to do this with violence," Kyle murmured, looking out the tinted window as they approached his old, dilapidated neighborhood. "Some men only understand violence, Kyle," Dominick replied calmly, taking a long sip of scotch from a crystal glass.
Men like your landlord prey on the vulnerable because they believe no one will ever come to stand in their way. They think the quiet ones have no power. Tonight, I am going to show him what happens when you touch something that belongs to Dominick Vance. The convoy slammed to a halt outside the crumbling apartment complex. The courtyard was lit by harsh floodlights. A crowd of low-life thugs, corrupt bailiffs, and local slumlords had gathered around a makeshift auction table. At the center of it stood Mr. Higgins, a fat, greasy man in a stained suit, holding up a delicate leather-bound notebook, Kyle's mother's personal journal containing her handwritten musical compositions. "Going once, going twice." Higgins laughed crudely to the cackling crowd. "Sold to the highest bidder for $50. The little loser isn't here to cry about it anyway."
Suddenly, the heavy metal gates of the courtyard were smashed open as two massive SUVs rammed through the iron bars, tearing them off their hinges with a deafening screech of torn metal. Panicked shouts filled the air as dozens of heavily armed, tactical-clad syndicate enforcers spilled out from the vehicles, forming an impenetrable perimeter around the courtyard. Automatic rifles were leveled at the crowd. The auction stopped instantly. Higgins dropped the journal onto the table, his face draining of all color as he recognized the terrifying crest of the Vance syndicate on the sides of the vehicles. The door of the center Maybach opened. Dominick stepped out into the rain, holding a massive black umbrella over Kyle, ensuring not a single drop of rain touched the young musician. Dominick walked with slow, deliberate, terrifying elegance across the muddy courtyard, his heavy boots echoing through the dead silence of the crowd.
Higgins trembled, his knees shaking so violently he almost fell over. "Mr. Vance, what is the meaning of this? This is a private eviction proceeding. This broke little street musician owes me money." Dominick didn't even look at Higgins. He looked at Marcus, who immediately stepped forward and handed Higgins a thick steel briefcase. Marcus snapped the latches open. Inside was $500,000 in crisp, stacked cash. Higgins' eyes went wide with greed. Is this to pay his debt?" Dominick finally looked at Higgins, his eyes colder than the winter rain. "That cash is for the building," Dominick said flatly. "I just bought this entire property from the city 5 minutes ago. I am now your landlord, Higgins." Higgins blinked, confused. What?" Dominick turned to his enforcers. "Seize everything in this building. Retrieve all of Kyle's possessions, especially his mother's journals. Handle them with extreme care.
If a single page is ripped, someone in this courtyard dies." 4 enforcers immediately stepped up to the table, carefully retrieving the leather notebook and handing it gently to Kyle. Kyle held his mother's journal to his chest, tears streaming down his face as he looked at Dominick with unmeasurable emotion. "Now," Dominick said, taking a step toward the cowering Higgins, "let us talk about your lease, Higgins." Higgins dropped to his knees in the mud, crying out in sheer terror.
"Please, Mr. Vance, I didn't know he was with you. I swear, I was just trying to get my rent. Take the building, take everything, just spare my life."
Dominick looked down at the sniveling man with absolute contempt. He didn't even raise his hand. He simply turned his head toward Marcus. "Higgins is evicted," Dominick ordered coldly. "Strip him of his assets, freeze his bank accounts, and ensure he is blacklisted from every property management firm in the country. Throw him into the street tonight, exactly as he tried to do to Kyle. If he ever steps within 10 miles of Kyle again, bury him." "Yes, Don Vance," Marcus replied instantly. Dominick turned back to Kyle, his dark face instantly softening into an expression of profound protection. He wrapped his arm tightly around Kyle's waist, pulling him close against his side under the warm shelter of the umbrella. "Let's go home, Kyle," Dominick whispered into his ear. "Your real life begins tonight." Back at the grand estate, the atmosphere changed completely. Kyle was no longer treated as a guest, he was treated as the heart of the home. Over the following weeks, the gloomy, cold halls of the Vance estate transformed into a place filled with laughter, music, and light. Every morning, Kyle sat in the sunlit conservatory, teaching young Leo how to play small melodies on a miniature violin. The boy's progress was miraculous. Leo was talking again, laughing and following Kyle around like a small shadow. Leo refused to sleep unless Kyle played him a lullaby on his cello from the hallway outside his room. And through it all, Dominick watched. The terrifying syndicate boss, who worked 16 hours a day managing high-stakes cartel negotiations and defending his territory, found himself spending every spare moment at home. He would stand in the doorway of the conservatory, leaning against the frame, watching Kyle interact with his son. Dominick was utterly obsessed. He flooded Kyle with gifts, bespoke hand-tailored suits, rare vintage sheet music collected from auctions in Europe, private gourmet chefs to cook Kyle's favorite meals. Yet what fascinated Dominick most was that Kyle never asked for any of it. Kyle remained modest, gentle, and utterly devoted to Leo's emotional healing. One late evening, a severe thunderstorm rolled over the estate.
Lightning cracked across the dark sky, shaking the windows of the grand library. Kyle was sitting near the burning fireplace, wrapped in a soft cashmere blanket, quietly reading a book. Dominick walked in, wearing an unbuttoned black silk shirt, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand. He walked over to the sofa and sat down beside Kyle. The space between them was electric with intense, unspoken tension that had been building for weeks. "Leo is fast asleep," Dominick said, his deep voice carrying a soft, intimate weight. "He asked if you would sing to him again tomorrow morning." Kyle smiled, setting his book aside. "He's doing so well, Dominick. His trauma is fading. He's strong." "He's strong because of you," Dominick replied, setting his glass on the table. He turned his body toward Kyle, leaning in until their faces were inches apart. "And what about you, Kyle? Are you happy here?" Kyle looked into Dominick's storm-gray eyes, feeling his breath catch in his throat. "I've never felt safer in my life. I used to think the world was just a cold, cruel place where weak people get crushed. But being here, being with you—" "You are not weak, Kyle," Dominick interrupted softly, raising his hand to cup Kyle's cheek. His broad, warm hand felt intoxicating against Kyle's skin. "You possess a grace and a courage that makes every powerful man in my syndicate look small. I have spent my entire life surrounded by violent, greedy monsters. You are the only pure thing I have ever encountered." Dominick leaned forward, closing the distance between them. The kiss was slow, deep, and filled with a raw, intense passion that made Kyle gasp softly against Dominick's lips. Dominick's arms wrapped tightly around Kyle's waist, lifting him effortlessly onto his lap.
Kyle wrapped his arms around Dominick's neck, running his fingers through the Don's dark hair, completely surrendering to the overwhelming sensation of being claimed, protected, and cherished by the most dangerous man in the city. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing heavily, Dominick pressed his forehead against Kyle's, his thumb gently caressing Kyle's flushed cheek. "You are mine now, Kyle," Dominick growled lovingly, his eyes burning with absolute possessiveness. "I will burn the world to ashes before I ever let anyone hurt you." However, peace in the syndicate world never lasts forever. Victor Vance, humiliated by his brother's public defense of Kyle and bitter over being pushed aside in favor of a broke street musician, had secretly made a deal with the rival Russian syndicate, led by a ruthless crime lord named Nikolai Petrov. Victor provided Petrov with the layout of the Vance estate and details of Dominick's security schedule, convincing Petrov that the quickest way to destroy Dominick Vance was to strike at his newly revealed soft spot, the street musician who had captured his heart and healed his heir. On a rainy Friday evening, Dominick was called away to an urgent emergency syndicate meeting downtown, a trap orchestrated by Victor to draw the Don away from his estate. Left alone at the estate with a reduced security guard, Kyle was in the second-floor nursery reading Leo a bedtime story. Suddenly, the estate's red emergency lights began to flash violently. The sound of muffled gunshots and shattered glass echoed from the main entrance downstairs. Kyle's blood ran cold. He immediately slammed the nursery door shut and locked it, pulling Leo behind him into the hidden panic room built behind the nursery closet, just as Dominick had instructed him to do in case of an emergency.
"Kyle, I'm scared," Leo whimpered, tears filling his eyes as the sound of footsteps roared up the stairs. "Shh, baby, listen to me," Kyle whispered, pressing a soft kiss to the top of Leo's head. "You get inside this safe room right now. Put these noise-canceling headphones on. Do not make a single sound until your dad comes through that door. Do you hear me?" "What about you?" Leo cried softly. "I'm going to make sure they don't find you," Kyle said firmly. Kyle pushed the child into the fortified room and slammed the heavy iron door, locking it from the outside using the master code Dominick had given him. Kyle turned around just as the main nursery doors were blown off their hinges with a loud explosion. Heavy smoke poured into the room, and 5 armed Russian mercenaries, led by Nikolai Petrov himself and a smirking Victor Vance, strode into the room. "Where is the boy?" Nikolai roared, racking the slide of his heavy pistol.
Victor stepped forward, grabbing Kyle by the throat and slamming him violently against the wall. "Tell us where the child is, you little parasite, or I will put a bullet through your head right now." Kyle choked for air, his throat burning under Victor's crushing grip. But despite the terrifying barrels of automatic weapons pointed at his chest, despite the imminent threat of death, Kyle stared back into Victor's eyes with absolute defiance. "I will never tell you," Kyle choked out, a bloody smile touching his lips. "You are a coward, Victor. You betrayed your own blood because you were too weak to earn respect on your own." Victor's face twisted in rage. He raised his gun, pressing the cold steel directly against Kyle's forehead. "Die then." Boom! The entire outer wall of the nursery erupted inward in a shower of concrete, glass, and steel. A massive armored transport vehicle belonging to the Vance syndicate had driven directly onto the second-floor balcony, breaching the room.
Through the dust and smoke stepped Dominick Vance. He was a sight of nightmare incarnate. Blood spattered his white shirt, his storm-gray eyes were burning with an apocalyptic rage, and a heavy tactical rifle was resting in his hands. He had realized Victor's trap halfway to the downtown meeting and had driven back to the estate like a bat out of hell, tearing through red lights and destroying anything in his path. "Dominick!" Victor screamed in sheer terror, dropping Kyle and stepping back. Dominick didn't speak. He moved with cold, terrifying precision. In a matter of seconds, 3 gunshots rang out. Nikolai Petrov and his top 2 lieutenants dropped to the floor, dead before they hit the ground. Dominick didn't even look at them. His eyes were entirely locked onto Victor, who was trembling on his knees, holding his hands up in desperate surrender. "Brother, please, it was Petrov. He forced me. He threatened my life." Victor sobbed, begging in the blood-stained carpet.
Dominick walked up to his brother. He didn't offer a single word of debate. He didn't scream. He simply raised his boot and kicked Victor across the chest, sending him crashing into the hallway, where 4 loyal Vance enforcers immediately pinned Victor to the floor. "Lock him in the deep vaults below the city," Dominick commanded, his voice cold enough to freeze blood. He will never see the sun again. Dominick dropped his weapon, ignoring the smoking battlefield around him, and rushed to Kyle, who was sitting against the wall, holding his bruised neck and catching his breath. Dominick dropped to his knees, pulling Kyle wildly into his arms, burying his face in Kyle's neck. Dominick was shaking. The terrifying Don was actually trembling with the sheer terror of almost losing the man he loved. "Are you hurt? Tell me, did they touch you?" Dominick pleaded frantically, his big hands inspecting Kyle's body for injuries. "I'm okay." "I'm okay, Dominick," Kyle whispered, pressing his hands against Dominick's cheeks. Leo is safe. He's in the panic room. They didn't find him. Dominick looked at Kyle, awe and overwhelming devotion shining through his tears. You protected my son. You stood up to them alone. I protected our family, Kyle said softly, smiling through his own tears. Dominick pulled Kyle into a deep, desperate kiss, holding him as if he were the most precious treasure in the universe. 3 days later. The central grand hall of the Vance syndicate's skyscraper headquarters was packed with over 500 high-ranking mafia bosses, street commanders, international allies, and wealthy associates from across the globe. The air was thick with tension. Word had spread fast about Victor's failed coup and the absolute destruction of the Petrov cartel. At the top of the grand marble staircase stood Dominick Vance, dressed in a flawless, tailored tuxedo. Beside him stood little Leo, dressed in a matching suit, holding his father's hand. And beside Leo stood Kyle. Kyle was dressed in a stunning, dark blue silk suit, his hair neatly styled, looking breathtakingly handsome. He carried no weapons, no heavy syndicate leather, but he carried an undeniable aura of grace, nobility, and iron-willed dignity. Dominick raised his hand, and the massive crowd of 500 ruthless criminals instantly fell into absolute, dead silence. You all know why we are here tonight. Dominick's commanding voice echoed off the high marble arches. A traitor attempted to destroy my home. He failed. My family stands stronger than ever. Dominick stepped forward, reaching out to take Kyle's hand in his own, raising their joined hands high for the entire syndicate to see. Many of you looked down on this man, Dominick declared, his dark eyes sweeping over the vast crowd with absolute authority. You saw a broke street musician. You saw someone weak, someone vulnerable, someone who did not belong in our world. Dominick paused, his voice dropping into a powerful, dangerous rumble that thrilled everyone in the room. You were wrong. Kyle saved my son's voice when none of you could. He stood in front of loaded guns to protect my blood while cowards ran. From this night forward, Kyle is not an outsider. He is my partner. He is the consort of this syndicate. Dominick turned to face Kyle, right there in front of the 500 most powerful criminals in the country. The ruthless Don dropped down onto one knee on the cold marble floor. The crowd gasped in shock. Never in the history of the underworld had a Don dropped to his knees for anyone. Dominick pulled out a velvet box, opening it to reveal a stunning, handcrafted ring crafted from black platinum and set with a flawless, brilliant blue diamond that matched Kyle's eyes. Kyle, Dominick said softly, his storm-gray eyes shining with absolute love and adoration. You gave me back my son. You gave me back my heart. Will you stay by my side forever, as my husband, my equal, and the lord of this family? Kyle's heart hammered against his ribs. Tears of overwhelming happiness filled his eyes. He looked at little Leo, who was beaming with a huge, joy-filled smile, nodding enthusiastically. He looked at Dominick, the terrifying protector who had built a wall of safety, luxury, and devotion around him. Yes, Kyle whispered, his voice echoing clearly across the grand hall. Yes, Dominick. Always. Dominick slid the ring onto Kyle's finger, stood up, pulled Kyle into his arms, and kissed him deeply as the entire grand hall erupted into thunderous, deafening applause and cheers. The broke street musician who had once played for spare change in the dirty subway had found his true home in the arms of the most powerful protector in the world. What would you have done if you were in Kyle's shoes? Would you have risked everything to protect little Leo in that room? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Share this story with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more intense Mafia romance audio dramas.